Good evening, everyone. I am very thankful to have you with us tonight. I hope you've had a good day, having a good day, and I appreciate your making this your priority. If you're watching this at the live first presentation, it's June the 28th, and no particular holidays or special days today, as we've said in the last few weeks. We'll just dig right in to our Bible lesson. Again, I do thank you for being with us tonight. We will tonight go into the second installment of the series that we started last week. Why would I believe that? Looking at belief in God, or our faith in God, in light of science and good sense and logical belief. Now, if you did not see last week's presentation, there actually was an awful lot of foundational material in there that I think you will want to go back and take a look at. I will give just a lightning quick overview of what we covered last week. We'll get into something tonight that is going to be really the foundation for the entire train of thought for all of our upcoming weeks of lessons. So tonight will be pivotal. We're going to move fast and cover an awful lot. But what we looked at last week were just these things very quickly. First of all, who the class was designed for. And the idea is this: no matter who you are, whether you're inclined to believe in God or whether you're inclined toward atheism or somewhere in between, this class is for you. Because we're not taking a predetermined position here. Now, it's obvious that I have concluded that there is a God, but my job right now is to see if that makes sense and see if I can either confirm that opinion in you or convince you of that, or the other possibility, I have to always be open to reevaluating that belief myself. So that is by no means a foregone conclusion. There will be some people who will like this class and some who won't. It may be very valuable to some of you, and by the way, I do appreciate some of the very encouraging comments from people even since last week. But if this class is not for you, I understand that. That is A-okay. It might be at a future time, and you could come back and pull it up off the archives. But we are very blessed here at Creve Hall to have any number of good classes going on, some excellent ones that you could tune into if this discussion is just really not your style. And it won't be for some people. But we started with this question then: do you believe in God? And whoever's watching this, you probably have a firm opinion on that already. You may have had it all your life. It may have changed from one to the other. And those opinions can change both ways as life goes on. But you probably know where you stand. But do you know confidently why you either do or do not believe in God? And could you defend that position intellectually, logically? Could you show somebody else why you think your position on that makes sense? That's what this whole discussion is going to be about. And why would it really matter? Well, it matters a lot. So we did take a few minutes to look at the implications of this, because if there is a God, and if He has communicated with us, then it makes all the difference. I won't just say in the world, it's actually much more than that. It will make all the difference for eternity as to whether we recognized His existence and honored Him or not. On the other hand, if there is no God, I really don't want to spend my life conforming to a set of guidelines that He didn't give because He doesn't exist, etc. And most of them would be fine ways to live anyway. But I want to know the truth for this. We talked about our goals for the discussion, and so I won't go through those again. And by the way, I will mention again, after the first few weeks, we will start putting some printable notes pages on the website along with this. So they won't be up at the time of tonight's lesson, but they will come later so that you can examine or even print if you want some of the ideas, because we're going to fly through here tonight. We also looked at some principles for our class, and they have to do with really intellectual honesty, truly seeking answers, and respect. We talked about the idea of, if God does exist, why doesn't He just display Himself? And so we looked at some of the possible reasons for that according to the way He has conducted Himself in past history. We talked about what faith is, and this bears repeating very quickly because we're not just talking about believing something you've been told that doesn't really make sense just because maybe it makes you feel good to believe it, or et cetera, whether that be a belief in God or atheism, either one. You can't have faith in that position just because you want to, just because somebody told you you ought to believe that, etc. Faith, and this is for those of you who are believers, faith is really believing something not yet seen, but based on a rock-solid, evidence-based trust in the reliability of the person or the source that's telling you something you haven't seen yet. That's what I want our faith to be founded on. Faith in God should be not something that makes no sense. It should be something that we haven't seen yet, but does make sense based on what we know and what we can observe. So we talked about then two levels of faith, one believing and then, of course, putting belief in action. But I would say, first of all, there has to be a logical, solid, confident belief that there is a God before there would be any point trying to put such a belief in action. And a lot of believers, I know, a lot of Christians would say, well, you shouldn't be asking these questions. You should just believe. But I propose that just believing on an emotional basis without logical evidence, etc., is really kind of a house of sand, especially if you then have to explain to your teenager or your recent college graduate who's questioning whether there really is a God or not, or your coworker, etc., your honest coworker who wants to know, why do you believe all that stuff? We need to be able to say, I believe it, and here are the reasons, and here's why it makes sense. All right, so in light of those things, we said then every person on earth really needs to confront these two questions. Is there a superior entity? Call him God, but really, we're talking respectfully. I think it's fine. And some people may say, well, if not sure he exists, I don't want to call him God. That implies the God of the Bible. No problem. Let's just talk about a superior entity for the moment, because we're going to chase down and see what the reality is. Does it make sense to believe in such a being, such an entity? And if so, do we have any reliable communication from such a superior entity? So I propose my very nerdy little flow chart to kind of examine those two questions a little bit more. Is there a God? If there's not, just be a decent person, do what seems right to you, because there's really not an objective right or wrong. And by the way, that's not to imply that atheists are immoral people. No, I've got a number of friends who are atheists who are fantastic people, and I would trust them all day long, etc., and enjoy them, their company, etc. No, not at all. It's just that if there is no God, there is no absolute objective basis for morals and right and wrong. And I'm afraid we are maybe seeing some of that in our society these days for a couple of generations now almost. Because if you keep teaching that there's not really a right or wrong, there's just whatever seems right to you, well, then don't be surprised when you get some pretty drastic behavior that's not helpful to society, because that's what seemed right to somebody else. Anyway, but if there's no God, then there is no objective basis for right and wrong. Just do what seems right to you. If there is a God, though, then we need to ask, has he communicated with mankind? If no, then again, just do what you need to do, because there's nothing to go by. If yes, then we need to chase down and see, do we have confidently a transmission, a communication that seems to be from this superior entity, and if so, we would want to follow that. So we looked at that a little bit. Then we looked at just this idea, and I've added one onto my slides since last week. I'm just always thinking of stuff, of course, that I should have put in there. So even though it kind of seems like your faith may be under the most vicious attack that it's ever been, not just a respectful disagreement with you by an atheist, but there are some now who seem like they're intent on attacking you and showing how stupid you are for believing in God. And unfortunately, there are some believers who do almost the reverse to our friends who do not believe. So there needs to be respect as we pursue the answer to these questions. And let there be no ad hominem attacks, that is, attacks that are directed at the person instead of the idea that they're proposing. We should be able to debate the ideas and our differences, the argument in the best sense of the word. That we do need to be able to do, and it should be okay to respectfully disagree. But there's never a reason for a personal attack. And what am I talking about? That's when the atheist says to the Christian, you know, if you were very bright, you would know that there is no God. And it's when the Christian says to the atheist, if you were a good person, maybe you would see this. No, both of those are just out of bounds. It's an understatement to say that's not helpful to anybody in discovering the truth. So, let's zoom in then on these questions. Is there a superior entity? Does it really make sense to believe that? And that's where we come to then to pick up this second part. In answering the question of whether God is real or myth, I've broken my thinking down this way. Now, you could do it a lot of different ways, but I really like to approach things logically, methodically, and in a decent order so that we can take each part, because they're not all the same thing, and see what makes sense. So there are, I would say, 4 obvious phenomena that demand an explanation, either by the existence of a creating superior entity or without one. And so here's the way I've broken that down. Number 1, the existence of all the matter and energy in the universe, okay, had to come from somewhere, so to speak. It exists, obviously, so it requires an explanation, and that's obviously a place where the hypothesis of God may have a part. The second is the precise structure and organization of the universe. It's not just blobs. We'll talk about that and get into those first 2 questions next week especially. But it's very precise, and that really requires an explanation. The third question is the initial appearance of any kind of life, any life at all from non-living materials, and the survival of that life. And then the fourth, of course, the diversity and complexity and precision of life that we see on this planet today, including ourselves, the human. So in my organization of thinking, those are the 4 questions that all hinge or will have a part in determining, is there a superior entity or not? So our goal will be to examine the competing theories or hypotheses for each of these 4 major questions and determine which make the most logical sense in each case. And as we do that, you are going, over the coming few weeks here, you are going to take on the roles of scientist and detective and lawyer and jury. Because we're going to try to uncover the evidence and the logic, examine it, see what argument can be made, and see eventually what seem most likely to be the facts of the matter. So, we just barely mentioned this but didn't go into it at all last week. Let's talk then, just quickly, because I'm going to give you an overview here because we're going to come back to them in detail. But of these 4 questions, what are some of the major theories that we might think about for them? So down the left-hand column there, I've put those same 4 questions we mentioned just a moment ago. All right, the next 2 columns are hypotheses. And by the way, once again, I'm going to use just pretty much interchangeably the terms theory, hypothesis, proposal, idea, maybe even argument, etc. Those things are not exactly the same, but for our purposes, that's what we're talking about, a proposed explanation, idea, etc. So I may use any of those words. Don't strain like, oh, he said theory last time, he said hypothesis this time. That's just kind of the way I'm going to use those, okay? So the first 2 columns are major theistic hypotheses or explanations, that is, involving some type of a superior entity. And don't be offended, I will also wind up some here calling those who believe in such a superior entity theists, okay? You might just say, well, I'm not a theist, I'm a Christian. You get what I mean. When I say theist and atheist, I'm using both of those terms with complete respect, all right? It's just belief or not, or what you believe. All right, so the God hypothesis, the superior entity or creation hypothesis, for each of these four major questions is that there is such an entity, that God created these things. And that would certainly be the explanation we would find if we looked in the Bible. That is not where we're taking our proof from at the moment, but you're very familiar, I think, with this hypothesis. We'll define it a little bit more in just a minute. The second column are some alternative theistic explanations or mechanisms. One is for the existence of all things, really just some whimsical mythologies. There is no other theistic explanation other than there is a creator. And that, by the way, is something that a good number of people who you almost might think they were atheists, but they're not. Some of them don't believe that he did much beyond the initial creation, but they do believe that a creator had to have made that happen. So it's not uncommon, actually, to find scientists who conduct themselves mostly as atheists, but actually do believe that there was probably a creator. All right, but by whimsical mythologies, I'm referring to things that were believed in past centuries, of the Greek gods, of Zeus, etc., or one that an ancient Hindu belief that there was a god who got sick after eating some bad food, and so he essentially vomited, and there was the earth. Okay, so those are not seriously proposed hypotheses, so we're not going to spend time on those. But you do notice down at the bottom there, there is an idea of theistic evolution. There are many people who do believe in God, but believe that instead of the creation happening in a very specific, all of a sudden way, that he actually set evolution in motion and let it proceed. It's something of a hybrid belief, I suppose, and we will come back and look at that toward the very end of our series of discussions. All right, on the far right side are some of the atheistic theories for these phenomena that we observe. And I'm going to, again, just mention them very briefly because we'll come back and look at them in more detail a bit later on. For the existence of all the matter and energy in the universe, there have been a few theories over time, and these are what I would call naturalistic or materialistic theories. And that's a term that we should define. Materialistic in this case doesn't mean that you care too much about your possessions. It means instead that the physical is all there is. So a naturalism or materialism, those terms are pretty much interchangeable, meaning there is no supernatural influence from God or some other entity, but that there is only the physical matter and energy and the laws of physics and nothing beyond that. So these are primarily naturalistic or materialistic explanations or hypotheses. There are a few that were widely held that recent science and discoveries over the last couple of decades have really put to rest. One was that the universe was eternal in its existence. Without creation, it just always was. And was in the state that it's currently in now, in the position that it's in, basically. Virtually no one will believe that anymore because recent scientific observation shows that the universe is expanding and can be traced back to a finite beginning. It has not always existed in the form that it's in. So that is kind of listed here as an older theory, that is an eternal existence of the universe in a steady state. Then there was an idea that the universe is, you might say, oscillating over billions and billions of years. That is to say that there would be a big bang, the universe then would explode outward and form galaxies, etc. And then at some point it would kind of run out of steam, and then it would slowly start falling back in with gravity back on itself, and it would all come together to one point and boom again. So that the idea, almost like a slinky in your hands perhaps, it would stretch out and then it would come back in and stretch out and just in an eternally repeating loop. That theory also has been largely discarded because, and in fact, my esteemed brother and good friend, Dr. Daniel Sissom, was explaining to me a while back, the reason for that is that it is realized that the outward expansion of the universe has reached what would be called an escape velocity. That is, it's moving fast enough, it can't come back in on itself. It will always continue to expand from this point on. So that theory is not really believed much anymore. Probably right now the prevailing atheistic belief would be that we really don't have a firm theory on yet. That the universe did have a finite beginning. It would be called by many a Big Bang. There was a precise time in the past when that happened, but we don't know how it happened. Now, some would add, but we know there was no God involved. You know, we know that. We don't have a theory on it, but that we know. Okay, well, we'll come to that. But there's really not a single firm theory on how this matter and energy came into existence without a creator. Now, that's quite a void, and everybody hates something that has no explanation, no known explanation. You know, we don't like a vacuum of knowledge. We'd kind of like to feel like we had at least some idea how something happened. And a lot of scientists, including atheistic ones, are no different. You know, it really bugs them, and that's just because you got a good mind. It bugs you when you don't know the explanation. Professor Stephen Hawking, just recently deceased, came up with a new theory a few years back that I think was probably original with him. That is that the universe spontaneously created itself. Now, when you hear that, you may say, what? He didn't say that. Yes, he did. I mean, I don't have the citation here, but I could pull it right up because I looked it up to see, did he really say that? Yes, he did. That he said, given a law such as gravity, the universe can and will spontaneously create itself. Now, that is not a widely held theory. I mean, we're not taking a vote anyway as to how popular something is. It's not a widely held theory because even an awful lot of physicists, astrophysicists, and others, including those who are staunchly atheistic, look at that and say, yeah, he went too far even for us on that one. Nice try, Professor Hawking. We hope you sold a lot of books with that because there's no way it's true. So, you know, we'll when we come back to that in more detail, we'll examine that. But other than that, there's really not a good explanation right now. Now, as you'll see later on, and this is in tiny print at the bottom of the slide there is an ongoing effort to come up with some explanation other than the Big Bang or something similar to that, because that theory could be quite compatible with Scripture. The Big Bang theory could be quite compatible with a creating God or superior entity. And so the quest for alternative explanations continues. All right, for the precise structure and organization of the universe, an older theory, as I mentioned a while ago, kind of is that it just landed in a random arrangement from its original appearance and was in a steady state. Well, we know that that's not true now. It is expanding, etc. So the current atheistic theory would be that there was a random explosion, a Big Bang. There was no guidance to it. All of the matter just shot outward, and it began to coalesce eventually into galaxies and stars and planets, etc. And so it had a finite beginning, currently expanding with just a random arrangement of where it currently is. All right, for the initial appearance of any kind of life on Earth from non-living material, the most serious atheistic explanation is something called abiogenesis. And that word, and I would put it in quotes because it's a phenomenon that we'd have to question whether it did or even could occur or not. But abiogenesis, if it could occur, simply means bio is life, genesis the beginning, and a means without. So that's the beginning of life from no life. Abiogenesis, it just means non-living things gave rise spontaneously to a living organism, which then survived, etc. Assumed to be spontaneous, there is huge research, and some of it quite fascinating, going on into this, like how in the world can we explain how this ever could have happened? You may think that scientists have already proved they can create life. Oh no, far from it. We'll see that. So there is no good theory on that, simply the belief, but we know that it happened because here we are, so it must have happened. All right, there is an additional theory, I might call it a little bit of a fringe theory, that either aliens from outside our solar system placed life on Earth and then perhaps let it evolve, or that there was a meteorite carrying some microbial life from somewhere else in the galaxy that landed here, then of course you would have to ask the question, all right, how did the life arise there? So it's really not considered to be a little bit of a far-fetched theory, but some have proposed that because they've said there's just no way it happened on this earth. There are some staunch atheists who have proposed such things because they said it had to come from somewhere. It did not arise spontaneously. We know there was no God, so we've got to come up with something else. But there's really not a good theory on this right now. So are you noticing that for the first question, on the atheistic side, there's really not a unified or widely held theory, not a good explanation, so we're still looking for that one. On the structure of the universe, it was, well, it's just random. This is the way it landed. On the third one, it's like, well, we don't know how that happened, but we're working on it. Okay, for the fourth one, at least there is, a widely held theory on the atheistic side that there was evolution, and I'll call that macroevolution, or the general theory of evolution, or as we'll see later on, could be called neo-Darwinism, by natural selection from mutations. This is the theory that you have heard and are probably fairly familiar with. An alternative to that is, as we will see later on, something called a punctuated equilibrium evolution, and so we'll get into that because that has very interesting implications. So that's a quick overview of the questions that we're going to look at. Well, here's what we have to ask, and this is so important. I'm not sure that we will finish it this evening, but we'll continue it because what we're about to talk about is the critical foundation for everything else we need to consider. And this next part, we have got to get right. How can we determine what is true? You have some widely different theories competing for acceptance. We want to know the truth. Well, you can't believe everything you hear, can you? Not from any side necessarily. So how will we determine what is true? Everything comes down to this. And let me just tell you this right off the bat. Here's the conclusion of it for honest thinkers. There are a number of things that you can never fully prove or disprove by human examination. The creation account is one of them. Now, that doesn't mean there's no evidence. Okay, we're going to look at that. That's why we're here. But you can't absolutely prove or disprove that creation took place based on human examination. And all of the atheistic theories that we just briefly talked about a moment ago fall into exactly the same category. They cannot be proven and not absolutely disproven by human examination. But that doesn't mean that we're lacking adequate evidence to address these questions. I'm going to show you we have overwhelming evidence to examine these questions, but we just need to say that up front. No, there is no proof like bam, what some people would call a drop the microphone moment. Here's the mic drop. Discussion's over. No, we won't have that. But what we will have is a huge amount of evidence that should be examined and I think should be found highly persuasive, to say the least. So, if we don't have something that by human examination that can prove or disprove any of the theories that we just talked about, well, here's what we can and must do. Consider all the possibilities and consider them critically. Discard any hypotheses or theories that can be disproven or are not compatible with known evidence, that is, they just absolutely do not make sense, and select the one or ones that are most fully compatible with the available evidence. All right? It's kind of obvious, isn't it? That shouldn't be controversial, you would think. In fact, you may be saying, well, okay, a child could have figured that out. Yeah, kind of. But it needs to be said, and you'll see why. So, a valid method for doing exactly that, what we just put in a two-sentence nutshell, a valid method for doing that is far more important than it might seem. As I alluded to just a moment ago, I'm not being overly dramatic here when I tell you that everything depends on how you determine what is true. And that's something people just haven't given much thought to. Okay? And if you don't give much thought to this and figure it out, then you may be easily bamboozled by things that people tell you that are really not true. But you've got to figure out how to detect that and know the difference. Everything comes to that. If we don't learn to do this and figure out a good way to do this, this is the place where an erroneous outcome can often be guaranteed before we even start. You know how sometimes if you take one wrong turn in your car, that might be easily corrected, but only if you correct it now. If you take one wrong turn and then you realize that 4 hours later, yeah, you're 2 states over, and it's going to be nowhere close to where you wanted to be. So if we take a wrong turn here, it could be disastrous. So this is well worth our time. Now, you may not like this thought exercise that we're about to embark on, but nothing could be more important. I hope you'll stick with me on this. Now, it's not going to be difficult if you follow along. You are absolutely capable of understanding and grasping every bit of this. All right, so that's what we want to do. Well, first of all, let's talk about science. We are often told, well, science has disproved the existence of God, or science has proved evolution to be a fact, or et cetera, et cetera. And then others will say, no, it hasn't, okay? Well, let's talk about science. I hope you love science as much as I do. You may not even think sometimes about things that are science or science-based, and yet you use them all the time. And so it has much to teach us. And we're going to start with something called the scientific method. And I want you to note that a lot of people say, well, the reason we can't believe in God is it's not scientific. It's not science. Well, that's correct. It's not science, right? So let's take a look at this. The scientific method is this, and it is the ideal standard which we ought to employ anytime possible. Let me give you an example. Now, you may not be able to see this on the slide, so here's what it says, the scientific method. Number 1, ask a question, all right? We're going to ask four major questions, and they'll have more parts to them as well. Number 2, do background research. See what you can learn about this question already. Sometimes it may have already been answered quite validly. Number 3, construct a hypothesis. That is to say, if you're not sure what the answer is, come up with a theory. That's okay. It's fine to do that. Say, okay, well, I think it could be, the explanation for this could be this. And that your hypothesis could be, I have come up with a steel alloy that has superior strength and lighter weight than what has existed before, and therefore it's going to save a ton of money and give better safety for bridges and parking decks and high-rise buildings. Well, that'd be good, wouldn't it? Okay, so there's your hypothesis, whatever it may be. So construct a hypothesis, then the yellow box there, test your hypothesis by doing an experiment. And then after that, collect your data from the experiment, and you have to design it properly. It has to be valid, etc. Analyze your data and draw a conclusion. See where the evidence leads you from this. And then finally, report your results so that you can honestly let other people critique the work, see if they can perhaps reproduce it, come up with the same conclusions or not, etc. Point out a mistake maybe, and see, was your hypothesis correct or not? It may or may not have been. All right, let me give you an example. About 2 weeks ago in the office, and Tiffany Watkins has to put up with me in my office several days a week. You should offer her your condolences for that. But at any rate, I had in our little staff room, our break room, whatever, among other things, I'm sometimes known to keep a little bit of candy or snacks in there. I wouldn't touch candy myself, you understand, but others might. Okay, so Pringles potato chips were in there, and I commented that the only problem with Pringles was by the time you get to the bottom, there's too much air in the can and the chips get stale by then. Now, I tend to nibble along on stuff, so for me it's like 2.5 weeks from the time I open it to the time I'm getting down to the bottom. I realize for some people this question would never occur to them because it's more like 30 minutes from opening the can till the can is empty. Okay, I'm not knocking you if that's you. They are good. Okay, but I said, but there's too much air in the can, so by the time you get to the bottom, the chips are getting kind of stale. Well, Tiffany said, well, you know what? I think they stay fresher better if you don't actually remove that little foil wrapper, just peel it back, but don't throw it away. And then when you're going to reseal the little plastic pop top on there, just fold that piece of foil back down and snap the lid over that. Well, I never thought about that. So her hypothesis is that the plastic lid by itself doesn't get a good air seal. It's better with the foil, and that will keep the chips fresher. Well, I ran the experiment. She's right. And that made me very happy to learn this, because now my Pringles at the bottom of the can are fresher than I've ever had them in all my life. This is a good thing. Okay, but that's just a simple example. But you see, there was a hypothesis there. We designed an experiment to test, and we could have, tested it much more precisely. I just tested it with my taste buds, but that worked pretty well in this case. And sure enough, the hypothesis was correct. If you leave the little foil thing in there and snap the lid back over it, your chips will taste better if they're around long enough for you to know the difference. Okay, that's pretty good. So the scientific method can often give you some pretty good answers, and anytime that you can employ it, you should. All right, so this is direct testing, the scientific method. But the little caveat I've added under there is it cannot absolutely prove things, but it may come close to proving something. It may give you enough evidence that is beyond any reasonable doubt, etc. But no, it can never 100% prove something. But it often can disprove something or falsify. That is to say, my experiment could have proved Tiffany's hypothesis wrong. Okay, I could have found that no, it doesn't actually make any difference. Okay, so the scientific method is really, really a beautiful thing. It is useful because it can sometimes approach a standard of proof, and it can very frequently disprove something. All right, so that's a great thing. Anytime you can use that, you ought to. But by the strictest definition, only things that can be directly tested by this scientific method classify as science. But we very frequently need to know the truth about things that transcend science. That is, they go beyond the boundaries of what you can directly test by the scientific method. But there's still very important questions that need to be answered. Okay, what do I mean? Let's take a look at a few examples of things that cannot be directly tested and therefore, by the strictest definition, are not science. Did a superior entity create the universe? I can't design an experiment to test that. All right? So a lot of people would say, well, see, there you go. It's not science. It's fine for you to go to church. You can talk about those things, but it's not science. So, we're not going to seriously entertain that. That's a different thing. Here's another one that cannot be directly tested and is therefore also not science by the strictest definition. Did the universe exist without a creator? That's not science either. So they're kind of in the same category when it comes to that. Now, that's not the end of that discussion, obviously, just the beginning of it. All right? But here are some more things that cannot be directly tested because we weren't there and we can't do the experiment. Did a superior entity initially create life? Or did life initially appear spontaneously? You can't prove or disprove or even actually directly test any of those things, and yet they're obviously very important. Let's take a few more. Did a superior entity design and create the complexity and precision of life that we see, not just the initial tiny little organism, etc.? Or did macroevolution, the general theory of evolution, take place? You can't fully disprove or falsify either one of those things, and you cannot fully prove either one of those things. Here's another one. Did Abraham Lincoln ever live? And you may say, well, you're being silly. No, I'm not being silly. Can you design an experiment to determine whether this character that you know is Abraham Lincoln? You may say, well, we've got photographs. That was some of the early photographs. Do you know they're real? Were you there? Can you run an experiment? Can you do anything to test those photographs to see if they really were somebody named Abraham Lincoln or whether they were an actor named John Doe? Do you see what I mean? You believe that he lived, but you can't directly test that. So scientifically, if you wanted to be a strict exclusionist, you'd have to say, well, no, we really can't even entertain the idea that he may have lived because we don't have a scientific way to test that. Same thing. Did World War II occur? He said, well, we actually have people, who told us they were there, really. And I believe them, by the way, absolutely. But can you run any kind of a scientific experiment to actually know that? How about this one? Who committed the murder? Okay, this is a question that unfortunately comes up many, many times every day in every nation on earth, actually. We need to know who committed a murder. But that's not a scientific question because by definition, you cannot construct an experiment that will test whether someone committed the murder or not. Did you eat lunch today? It's, well, yeah. You prove it? Well, I've got a receipt. Yeah. That's not an experiment. You could have gotten a receipt anywhere. You could have picked it up off the floor in McDonald's or wherever. You probably wouldn't eat in a place like that, but I would. At any rate, they have some healthy stuff. I'm going to claim that's what I eat, okay? But never mind my digression. Can you prove you ate lunch today? So, well, there's food in my stomach. Well, that doesn't mean it got there because you ate lunch today. Okay, I'm being a little bit silly, but not really, because we need to prove the point. These things cannot be directly tested. And you, by now, are saying, well, yeah, but there's other proof of that. Ah, yes, right you are. We need to know the truth about a number of things that transcend science. They go beyond the bounds of what we can test with the scientific method. And it would be arbitrary and very incorrect to say that only the things that can be measured by science can be considered or can be true. Okay, clearly from these examples, there are plenty of things that we have to consider, and they can be true or false, even though the scientific method is powerless to test them and examine them. So that's the first point. Don't let anybody fool you into equating science with knowledge and truth. They are not the same things. Science is a beautiful tool that can give us knowledge and truth on a good many topics. But there are plenty of things we need to know that go beyond the bounds of science, and they're no less true. The fact that you can't directly test something or even directly observe something doesn't mean that it isn't possible. It doesn't mean that it's not absolutely true. It simply means that human science and observation are not adequate to determine it. So is there some other method to determine truth in questions or phenomena that cannot be directly tested, like every single one of these major things that we're trying to look at? Well, yeah, there has to be. We have to have a valid but more comprehensive truth determination method that will incorporate and respect science as well as evidence that transcends science. It's the only way we can answer these questions. Okay, and it has to employ a healthy skepticism, and by that I mean you don't believe everything you're told. You're open to believing it, but only if it makes sense. That is to say, okay, I'll consider your idea, but I'll believe it when I see the evidence for it, the logic for it, okay? And until then, I don't accept it, okay? It also has to employ critical analysis without any bias or what we would call a priori conditions. And I'm going to come back and show you a definition for that in a moment. But that is, for the moment, let's just say that is arbitrarily chosen foregone conclusions. An a priori assumption or condition is when I've already made my mind up before I ever even really look at the thing. So we'll come back to that idea. That will certainly disqualify any pursuit of truth right there. All right, so you might call it a method like that, you might call it a legal or historical proof method, okay? Because it's the type of method that a court and a jury would try to apply to determine guilt or innocence. Since they can't go back and run an experiment, they have to look at all the evidence and put it together and see what looks like the truth. So let's build on that and equip, let's take a method like that and equip it to handle science-related questions as well as things that go beyond science. So here's what I'm going to show you, my proposal for a valid and logical method in 6 steps, and it borrows from all of those things. I haven't seen somebody else put this together. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm any great thinker. No, not at all. Because people have put this together, just maybe haven't put it on paper or haven't put it in words. But this is critical. Again, this is where we will go right or go wrong if we don't have this down to a good, valid, agreed method. Here's number 1. All hypotheses must be considered, and they all must be subjected to critical analysis. That is to say, I have to be willing, open-minded, honest enough to consider every theory, every hypothesis. Not the one I've always been taught, not the one I want to believe, not the one that's going to make me more popular among the people who might or might not give me a promotion at work, none of that. I have to give fair consideration to all hypotheses that are seriously proposed. And I have to be willing to subject all of them to critical analysis. That is, I'm looking for the flaws to see if they're true or not. If you're not willing to do this, don't pretend that you're actually seeking the truth. If you are an atheist and you're not willing to seriously consider that the possibility of a superior entity who may have created, then you're not really looking for the truth. You're just looking to believe what you want to believe. Now, let me turn that around so I can get everybody mad at me, okay? If you're a person who believes in God and you're not even willing to consider seriously the idea that maybe there's not a God, then you also are not really looking for the truth. You're looking for something you want to believe. So it doesn't matter who you are. Do you get the picture? You have got to be willing to give a valid, honest, fair, and critical assessment to every serious idea that is presented. That's where it has to start. So whether you're atheist or theist, believer, agnostic, just like we said, you're not looking for the truth. Does the fact that you prefer a particular belief make it true? No, I don't think so, because your opponent would say just the opposite, your intellectual opponent. Does the fact that you refuse to consider something make it any less true? No, it just puts blinders on you, that's all. So if our analysis of anything is to be honest and valid, there cannot be any a priori beliefs, as I mentioned a while ago, involved. And just a working you can look that up. A working definition of it, though, would be this: something that is held to be true beyond question, without need for any supporting evidence or logic. That is to say, I choose to believe it because I know it's true, and I don't need any evidence because I know it's true, and I'm not willing to consider that it might not be true because I know it's true. Yeah, okay, that's an a priori belief. Some people have such a belief in God. Some people have such a belief that there is no God. Both of them are equally invalid. So if we really want to look for truth, we've got to be willing to do that. All right? Well, what are some reasons that theist believers give or use for refusing to consider atheistic theories? Well, how about I read in the Bible that God is real and that He carried out the creation, so I know it's true. So I don't need to consider that there's not a God. Kind of circular reasoning there, isn't it? How about my parents told me from the time before I can even remember that there was a God. So I know it's true, so I'm not going to consider that there might not be a God. Not valid. They might be right. They could be wrong. If we're going to be open-minded about it, we need to figure that out. How about I look at everything around me and I know there has to be a God, so I'm not going to consider that there might not be. Well, all right, you may have some evidence there, but it's no good unless you actually give a fair consideration to the alternatives. So some of the reasons that believers either use or state even for refusing to consider alternate ideas may depend on some circular reasoning. They may be a priori beliefs. That is to say, they just believe it and they're not willing to question it. I think we need to question it if we're really going to be confident in what we believe for reasons we've already covered. Well, what about reasons that atheists give or use for refusing to consider that there might be a creator? Some of them are these. It can't be directly tested or directly observed, so it's not science, and so therefore it cannot be. We're not going to consider it. Or it might be, well, we can only consider science. And it's okay if you want to go to church, et cetera, but don't ask, don't tell me that it's a serious hypothesis because it's not science. And so it will be discarded without consideration. How about it can't be falsified? That is, it can't be potentially proven wrong, by like our scientific method with the potato chips. And so therefore, to accept such a belief would have to be what they call magical thinking. That is, you just want to believe that. You've got some magic creation you call God, but, you can't ever prove him wrong, so therefore you can't ever believe in it. Well, we'll examine that. It's not science. Or how about, maybe not in so many words, but I can't fathom such a being, and maybe I don't want to think about the implications of there being such a being. But is that a reason for not considering the possibilities? Or how about this? It violates the a priori commitment to considering only natural or material causes as possibilities. Well, where did you get that rule? Okay, now people hold it sacred, but that is tantamount to intellectual malpractice. To say, well, I can't consider a God because I have a commitment that there can be no such thing. There can be nothing supernatural, so therefore I can't consider it, so therefore he doesn't exist. Well, let's look at just a few quick examples of refusing to consider various hypotheses. I'm going to throw a couple out, let you think about them, and then that's where we'll pick up next Sunday evening. All right? How about if you leave a restaurant late at night, it's dark, and so you walk 3 blocks over to where your car is, and when you get to the car, you discover you don't have your keys. Where are they? Well, they could be maybe in another pocket. They could be sitting on the table back at the restaurant. They could be laying in the grass somewhere in between. They could be under a street light, etc. Well, what if you say, well, I know they're under a street light, so I'm not going to look anywhere else. They can only be under one of the street lights. And I refuse to consider any other possibility. I mean, is that going to help you find your car keys? I hope it does. What about if there are some flies, who go to a very wise older fly and say, we've heard that there's a horrible death machine called a fly swatter. Could this be true? Or is this just pure myth? And so think about that. His logic, well, we'll save the logic for next time. How about who committed the murder? Who was the shooter? But I'm only willing to consider certain. It's like, well, all the evidence says it looks like John Smith committed the murder. It's like, nope, can't be John Smith. Nope, he's a fine man, so it can't be him. So we're not going to consider that theory. Like, well, but all the evidence says it was him. Nope, sorry, can't be him. Or, because I said it can't be him, etc. Where are the car keys if I'm stubborn about it? Is there really a fly swatter if I'm too convinced of my own supreme knowledge to believe it because I've never seen one, so therefore there can't be one? Who was the shooter if I really don't want it to be the guy who clearly did it? Think about that. Let's pick this up next week. Now, I hope that you will hang with me after we talk about going through this valid truth method, which is the necessary critical foundation for everything else we're going to look at. If we don't get this right, we don't stand a chance. I hope you'll stick with me through the completion of this, and then we start looking at the vastness of the universe, how it's put together, and then life, and then the complexity of life, all leading us back toward the answers to those 4 questions. Was there a God or not? What makes sense in light of all the evidence? Thank you very much for sticking with us and being part of this discussion. I hope it will be useful to you. I hope you have a great week ahead. I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you for joining us online. Please join us again for our next service. Our worship services are in person and online, Sundays at 8:15 and 10 o'clock. Our Bible study is online only Sundays at 5 o'clock. Our summer series is online only Wednesdays at 6:30. You can also watch our daily devotionals and other special presentations on Facebook on the Creve Hall COC videos page. Again, thank you for joining us online.